You wake to the chill of stone beneath your bare feet, the flickering torchlight casting long, dancing shadows across the chamber walls. The air smells of damp wool and old dust, a scent that seems to cling to the heavy tapestries that imprison the room. Your heart hammers against your ribs like a blacksmith's forge, a frantic rhythm echoing in the silence that is broken only by the distant, mournful howl of the wind whistling through the arrow slits. You are 12 years old. Your body is still slender as a reed, unshaped and fragile. Yet, you stand encased in a gown of stiff brocade that scratches against your skin, embroidered with silver threads that gleam like captured moonlight, but weigh you down like iron chains. You are a child dressed as an idol, a statue to be admired, not a human being to be held. Then, the heavy oak door creaks open. In steps a man twice your age. His breath is sour with the heavy wine from the feast below, his footsteps heavy with the authority of one who commands armies. His eyes are shadowed, not by affection, but by the crushing expectations of kingdoms. This is no dream of romance. This is your wedding night. And the fear coils in your gut like a cold serpent. Tonight, your innocence is the wax upon which a seal of ink and blood will be pressed. Your body is no longer your own. It is a vessel for heirs yet unborn, a political asset where failure whispers of annulment, disgrace, or the agony of a childbed that might claim your life before the sun rises. This nightmare was the reality for the queens of the Middle Ages. Their stories are often buried under the dry dates of battles and treaties, but if we listen closely to the whispers in the archives, we find tales of survival and suffering that defy imagination. Our first journey takes us to the early 12th century, into the dim glow of a single tallow candle sputtering against the draughts of an ancient castle. Here stands a girl named Matilda, her small hands clutching the edge of a wooden chest carved with imperial eagles. Born around 1102 AD in the royal court of England, Matilda knew from the cradle that her life was currency. Her father, King Henry I, was a ruler whose realm stretched from the misty shores of Normandy to the rugged hills of Wales. But Henry saw in Matilda not a daughter to cherish, but a pawn to secure his flank against the shifting sands of European power. The erasure of her childhood began early. By 1109 AD, when she was merely 7 years old, envoys from the Holy Roman Empire arrived at the English court. They bore proposals from Emperor Henry V, a man in his 20s, battle-hardened, ambitious, and desperate to bind his vast domains to the Anglo-Norman throne. The betrothal was sealed in Utrecht on April 10th, 1110 AD. Imagine the terror of an 8-year-old girl dispatched across the Channel to Germany, a land of dense, dark forests and towering cathedrals that seemed to scrape the sky. The air here carried the sharp tang of pine and the distant clang of blacksmiths forging swords for endless wars. She was effectively a gold-plated orphan, stripped of her mother's comfort and placed under the guardianship of Archbishop Bruno of Trier. For 4 years, she was drilled in the guttural tones of the German tongue and the intricate, rigid dances of court etiquette. She learned the weight of a crown before she arguably understood the weight of her own soul. But beneath the lessons in Latin prayers and the fitting of embroidered silks, a quiet dread grew. It was a fear she could not speak, confessing it only to the stone saints in the chapel. What child could fathom the intimacies demanded of a wife? She was being prepared to surrender her body to a stranger's touch in a bedchamber where privacy was a myth, and witnesses lurked behind curtains to confirm the union's validity. The inevitable day arrived on January 7th, 1114 AD, in the Grand Cathedral of Mainz. The cathedral's arches soared high above, mirroring the towering ambitions of the men who had orchestrated this sale of a child. Matilda, now 12, walked the aisle. She was draped in a gown of crimson velvet, so heavy with gold thread that it chafed her skin, her face hidden behind a veil, a gossamer barrier, against the stares of assembled nobles from across the empire. The air was thick, almost suffocating, with incense, its smoky tendrils curling around the altar. Vows were exchanged in Latin words she understood intellectually, but whose visceral, physical meaning eluded her youthful grasp. Beside her stood Henry V. He was tall, stern, his face marked by the scars of campaigns against rebellious dukes. When he took her hand, his grip spoke of possession, not affection. Outside, the bells tolled, echoing through the Rhine Valley, announcing that the deed was done. The procession moved to the imperial palace. There, feasts of roasted boar and spiced wine masked the underlying tension, the laughter of the court jarring against the silence in the girl's heart. But as night fell, the festivities faded, and the true duty began. In a chamber adorned with tapestries depicting heroic conquests, violent scenes of men taking what they desired, the reality descended. Servants stripped the bed of its linens, a ritual preparation to prove her purity and his potency. In this era, an obsession with legitimate heirs turned the bedroom into a stage. Matilda's pulse raced, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the cold air raised gooseflesh on her arms. The emperor approached. His breath was heavy with mead, and he moved with the entitlement of a ruler accustomed to command. The chronicles do not record her tears or protests. History was written by men who viewed such vulnerabilities as irrelevant, erasing the terror of the moment from the pages of time. But the power imbalance was stark and terrifying. A girl of 12 yielding to a man of 28, a body utterly unready for the demands placed upon it. In the empire's eyes, this consummation was a triumph. It sealed the alliance in ink and fluids. But for Matilda, it marked the erasure of her childhood, the first scar in a life defined by political maneuvering. The tragedy, however, was that the sacrifice bore no fruit. Years later, when Henry V died on the 23rd of May 1125 AD, Matilda was left a widow at 23. The marriage's fruitlessness haunted her. No heirs had come, perhaps due to her extreme youth at the start, or the emperor's health, plagued by the rigors of constant warfare. She returned to her father's court in Normandy, carrying the title of Empress, but it was a hollow crown that only amplified her isolation. Whispers at court suggested her barrenness was a curse, and though she would later fight fiercely for the English throne, in those early nights, alone with her thoughts amid the rustle of silk sheets, the fear lingered. It was not just the fear of pain, but the crushing fear of failure, the failure to produce the sons that dynasties demanded, a burden that threatened to define her entire existence. Across the Channel, in the sun-drenched vineyards of Aquitaine, another young heiress faced a fate that would test the boundaries of her spirit. Her story is intertwined with the scent of blooming lavender and the salty breeze from the Atlantic, a world away from the grey stone of the north. Eleanor of Aquitaine, born around 1122 AD, was a creature of the south. She grew up in the opulent court of Poitiers, where troubadours sang of courtly love, and the air hummed with poetry and passion. At 15, she was a vision of vitality, with auburn hair that cascaded like autumn leaves and eyes sharp as a falcon's gaze. But upon her father's death in 1137, her inheritance, one of Europe's richest duchies, made her a target. She was a prize to be claimed before rivals could snatch her away. The dying King Louis VI of France orchestrated her marriage to his son, Louis VII, to merge Aquitaine's vast lands with the Capetian crown. The union was hastily solemnized on July 25, 1137, in the Cathedral of Saint-André in Bordeaux. The summer heat mingled with the heavy aroma of beeswax candles, and fresh rushes strewn across the floor, creating a heady, stifling atmosphere. Eleanor, dressed in a surcoat of sapphire blue silk embroidered with the golden lions of her house, exchanged vows with Louis. But the man standing beside her was a jarring contrast to the vibrant lords of Aquitaine. Louis, 17 and deeply pious, had been raised for the church, not the throne. His face was pale from a monastic upbringing. He seemed more monk than monarch, his hands trembling as he placed the ring on her finger. The feast that followed overflowed with roasted peacocks and song, but Eleanor's mind surely wandered to the chamber awaiting them. As dusk fell, casting long shadows over the Garonne River, the bedding ceremony began. Priests blessed the mattress, and courtiers toasted their fertility with goblets of hippocras, a spiced wine that burned going down. But when the heavy curtains were drawn, Eleanor found herself trapped in a clash of worlds. Louis approached the marriage bed not with passion, but with hesitation. Chronicles hint at his reluctance, likely born from religious scruples that viewed pleasure even within marriage as a sin. For a woman raised on the romantic ideals of troubadours, the night was a confusing navigation of awkward silences and fumbling duty. The fear here was not of violence, but of a different kind of erasure, the suffocation of her fire. Without sons, her position was precarious. For years, the marriage yielded only daughters, fueling Louis's doubts and Eleanor's frustrations. Whispers in the Parisian court spoke of her spirited nature clashing with his piety. She famously remarked she had married a monk, not a king. By 1152, the incompatibility was undeniable. The marriage was annulled, and Eleanor, her fears transformed into ambition, would go on to marry Henry II of England, shaping the Angevin Empire. But that first wedding night remained a reminder of the vulnerability of a woman whose soul was too large for the cage built for her. Far to the north, in the fog-shrouded coasts of Flanders, a different tale unfolded, one not of cold piety, but of raw defiance and the looming threat of spiritual damnation. Matilda of Flanders, born circa 1031, grew up in a court buzzing with merchants and diplomats, the air redolent of sea salt and freshly dyed wool. By her late teens, she caught the eye of William, Duke of Normandy, a man who would become known as the Conqueror, but was then known simply as the Bastard. William was a man risen to power through sheer ferocity, his illegitimacy a stain that barred him from many noble matches. When he sent envoys to propose, legends claim Matilda rebuffed him with brutal honesty, declaring she would wed no bastard. What followed is a story embroidered by chroniclers, perhaps myth, perhaps a reflection of Norman truth. It is said, William rode to Bruges, caught her in the street as she left church, and dragged her off her horse by her long braids, beating her before riding away. Historians often dismiss this as propaganda designed to show William's dominance. Yet, even if the violence was metaphorical, the psychological landscape was terrifying. Matilda agreed to marry him, perhaps realizing that a man who spoke the language of such violence would eventually take what he wanted. But the true terror of their union was not just physical, it was spiritual. Their betrothal around 1049 sparked papal fury. They were distant cousins, violating church prohibitions on consanguinity. Pope Leo IX banned the union at the Council of Reims, forcing a delay that tested William's patience. For Matilda, waiting in her chambers in Bruges, the scent of lavender sachets did little to calm nerves frayed by uncertainty. Excommunication loomed a spiritual death in an age when salvation was paramount. To marry William was to defy God's vicar on earth. The wedding finally occurred in 1051, likely at Eu in Normandy. It was a discreet, almost secretive affair, the vows exchanged in a chapel overlooking the Channel's churning waves, far from the prying eyes of Rome. That night, in a hall where hearths crackled with oak logs, the consummation proceeded under the shadow of ecclesiastical disapproval. Matilda's gown of Flemish linen gave way to the reality of marital duty with a warrior whose calloused hands were a constant reminder of his violent life. Her fear manifested in the unknown. Would the Pope's curse render their children illegitimate? Would she birth monsters, dooming the dynasty? To appease the church and lift the stain of sin, they would eventually found two great abbeys in Caen, the Abbaye aux Hommes and the Abbaye aux Dames. Matilda's fertility would triumph over her apprehensions, bearing 9 or 10 children. But on that wedding night, lying beside a man who defied popes and conquered kingdoms, she had to conquer her own terror of being damned for love and ambition. Shifting eastward to the opulent halls of Paris, where the Seine's waters lapped against stone quays laden with spices from distant ports, we meet a princess bred for perfection. Isabella, the she-wolf of France, entered the world around 1295 AD, the daughter of King Philip IV and Joan I of Navarre, raised amid the grandeur of the Louvre, with its gardens blooming in spring and halls echoing with minstrels' lutes. She embodied the grace of the Capetian lineage, fair-haired, intelligent, and destined for a throne. By 1307 AD, negotiations sealed her fate. Marriage to Edward II of England, a union designed to mend the frayed ties over Gascony, the last English foothold in France. At just 12 years old, Isabella crossed the Channel in January 1308 AD, her ship battling winter gales to dock at Boulogne-sur-Mer. The wedding on January 25th unfolded in the town's cathedral, its nave filled with the heavy aroma of frankincense and the metallic glint of armored knights. Isabella, resplendent in a gown of silver tissue veiled in gauze, exchanged vows with Edward. At 23, the English king was handsome, his Plantagenet features softened by a love of theatre and fine arts. To the observer, they were the picture of a fairy tale monarchy, but joy curdled swiftly into humiliation. At the wedding banquet, a scene unfolded that would stain Isabella's memory forever. Edward bestowed the lavish wedding gifts, jewelry and finery meant for his bride, not upon Isabella, but upon Piers Gaveston, his favourite Gascon knight. While the court watched in stunned silence, the king seated Gaveston beside him, laughing and whispering, while Isabella sat sidelined, her royal uncles seething at the public insult. The wedding night, in a chamber warmed by braziers glowing with charcoal, unfolded amid this suffocating tension. Attendants performed the bedding ritual, drawing the heavy curtains around the four-poster bed as priests murmured blessings meant to ensure fertility. But as the heavy velvet closed them in, Isabella's fear was palpable not of the act itself, but of her own irrelevance. She felt the cold draft on her skin and the crushing weight of Edward's indifference. His eyes were distant, as if envisioning another. Chronicles noted his preference for Gaveston, hinting at a lack of ardour that left the marriage unconsummated that eve, or at the very least, deeply unfulfilling. For a queen, being ignored is more dangerous than being hated. Without immediate heirs, her position was tenuous, her body scrutinized daily for signs of swelling. It would be years before the future Edward III was born, and by then, the resentment planted on that first night had taken deep root, destined to blossom into a rebellion that would topple a king. A century later, another French princess would cross the Channel, not to a husband who loved another man, but to a husband who loved only God. In the verdant fields of Anjou, where the Loire River wound like a silver thread through vineyards, Margaret of Anjou was born in 1430 AD. Her childhood, steeped in the early Renaissance stirrings of art and learning, prepared her for the intricate web of European diplomacy. By 1444 AD, with the 100 Years' War grinding towards a bloody stalemate, she was chosen as the peace weaver, proposed as a bride for King Henry VI of England. Margaret arrived in England on April 9, 1445 AD, her ship greeted by cheering crowds and the salty tang of the Solent. The wedding took place on April 23 at Titchfield Abbey, a modest Cistercian house where vows were spoken before an altar draped in white samite. Margaret, just 15 and dressed in embroidered satin with her dark hair bound in pearls, finally faced her groom. Henry VI, 23 years old, was a man of gentle demeanour, his hands soft from prayer rather than the sword. He was a saintly king, fragile and otherworldly. The feast featured subtleties, sugar sculptures of lions and eagles, but the air hummed with political undercurrents. That night, in the Abbey's guest quarters, the walls echoed not with bawdy wedding songs, but with the distant chants of monks. The consummation proceeded, but it was shrouded in a peculiar, quiet dread. Henry's mental fragility, which would later fracture into full-blown catatonia, foreshadowed the encounter. His touch was hesitant, tempered by a piety that bordered on phobia of the flesh. For Margaret, the apprehension centered on the unknown. She was trapped in a foreign land with a husband prone to saintly abstractions, yet she carried the terrifying imperative to bear heirs in a court rife with factions. In the dim light, amidst the scent of beeswax and herbs strewn on the floor, she must have realized that her husband was absent even when he was present. No pregnancy followed that night, nor for many years. Their son Edward would not arrive until 1453 AD, amid vicious rumors of illegitimacy fueled by the king's madness. That silent, sterile wedding night was the first step toward the Wars of the Roses, a conflict that would demand Margaret trade her silks for armor. Deep in the Welsh marches, where the mist clung to the valleys like a shroud, and the silence was heavy with ancient secrets, the final and perhaps most harrowing chapter of our story began. Here, we meet Margaret Beaufort, a girl whose life would become the very foundation of the Tudor dynasty, but whose beginning was marked by a brutality that staggers the modern mind. Born on the 31st of May, 1443, at Bletsoe Castle, Margaret was a descendant of John of Gaunt's legitimized line. This royal blood was both her gift and her curse. She inherited vast estates, making her a coveted ward in a kingdom fracturing under the weight of civil war. By 1455, King Henry VI, desperate to bolster the Lancastrian cause, granted her hand to his half-brother, Edmund Tudor, the Earl of Richmond. Margaret was just 12 years old when she was wed on November 1st, 1455. The ceremony, likely held at her manor in Lamphy, Pembrokeshire, was a simple, hurried affair, stripped of the usual pomp by the looming threat of Yorkist unrest. The celebration was brief, the joy non-existent. The wedding night took place in a chamber lit by rushlights flickering in iron holders, the air thick with the smell of peat smoke and dried rosemary. Edmund was 24, a man battle-tested and fully grown. In the eyes of the church and the law, Margaret was a wife. In the eyes of nature, she was a child. But the Wars of the Roses waited for no one. Edmund, driven by the frantic dynastic need to secure an heir before the next battle, consummated the marriage swiftly. Margaret's terror was visceral. It was the pain of an immature body forced to yield, the cold sweat on her brow, and the overwhelming fear of what this act portended. This was not love. It was a deployment of resources. The urgency of the times demanded that a child be treated as a broodmare. The tragedy compounded with horrifying speed. Margaret fell pregnant almost immediately, by early 1456. But before the child could be born, the war claimed her husband. Edmund died of the plague on November 3rd, leaving Margaret a widow at 13. Alone, terrified, and besieged within the cold stone walls of Pembroke Castle, she went into labour on the 28th of January 1457. The ordeal that followed is the stuff of nightmares. Her 13-year-old frame was racked by an agony that lasted for hours, a physical trauma so severe that it left permanent scars on her body. The birth was a miracle of survival, but the damage was done. Margaret would never bear another child. From that bed of blood and pain, she produced a son, Henry, the future king, Henry VII. He was her sole child, a life brought forth from the very brink of death. Margaret survived. She would go on to marry twice more, first to Henry Stafford in 1458, and then strategically to Thomas Stanley in 1472, seeking protection in a world of wolves. She navigated the thorns of the Rose Wars with a brilliant, calculating mind, plotting her son's ascent to the throne. By the time of her death in 1509, she had founded colleges and shaped the very fabric of Tudor England. But the shadow of that wedding night and the torture of her childbed endured a testament to the era's cruelties. These tales, woven from the threads of history, reveal the silent horrors behind the gilded crowns we so often admire. We see queens bound by duty's iron grip, facing nights where fear was the uninvited guest. Their bodies were bartered for power, their spirits tested in the crucible of expectation. And yet, from such darkness, a blinding resilience emerges. It echoes through the centuries, reminding us that even in the hush of a medieval chamber, amidst the stone and the cold, the human heart beats defiant against the night.